Uinta Basin special events coverage on VTV6 and Strata WebView is made possible by Century 21 Parker Real Estate Professionals, The Porch Southern Cuisine, Uinta Basin Healthcare, and Wind River Wireless.
We are very happy to welcome you here tonight to our second Roosevelt Centennial Historical Lecture. And we are very happy to welcome also VTV. And they are going to record these series, and hopefully we'll be having one each month. VTV will be making this available to us. They will have it for us for purchase, and there's the form back there on the table that you can pick up if you'd like to purchase these videos of these lectures. And also they will have them on their website and their TV channel, Channel 6. So you know that. Thank you. We'd like to welcome this evening Professor H. Bert Jensen. He is an Associate Professor of English in American Studies and Folklore here at USU. Mr. Jensen is a native of the Basin. He's a father of 5. He's married to Diana Lynn of Echo, Utah, and he's been at USU for 20 years. And over on the wall, he's brought some pictures that you have been looking at before you came, and we hope that someone's here tonight can identify all the people that are in there. And there'll be some prizes available if they can. We'll let Professor Jensen tell you about that. So without further ado, we needed to say one thing. With our Roosevelt Centennial celebrations, we're also inviting you to contribute to our Community Pool and Wellness Center project too. So we'll have a donation box right back here on the table, and also afterwards we'll have refreshments, and they're sponsored and provided by Aggie Station here at USU. So if I've covered everything now, we'll turn the time over to Professor Jensen.
I'm really grateful for this opportunity to come tonight. I put together a lot of pictures. We'll be going through some very quickly. It's mostly just to kind of set our minds thinking and give us some visual impact, and there'll be information that goes along with it. I've read a lot of the writings in the early history of Duchesne County, vintage newspapers, been into the city archives to the minutes, been into some photos and other kinds of things in preparation. So I think that some of the stuff we'll find will be really interesting, not only because it's historical, but because it might surprise us some of the things that went on and the decisions that had to be made over time. To start out with, I want to try and introduce you a little bit to the world in which the Uinta Basin was founded, and Roosevelt City in particular. And at the Chicago Exposition in 1893, there were a couple of notable individuals there. One was the young historian Frederick Jackson Turner. The other one was Buffalo Bill Cody, and they're just across the way from one another. And of course, Buffalo Bill Cody is putting on his Wild West show. And Frederick Jackson Turner was, much like myself, giving a dry talk someplace over another building. But it was very interesting to people because some of the things that he had to say. One of the things that we can recognize from both of these men is that if they were to agree on one thing, and you have to understand, Buffalo Bill Cody is a guy who came from the conquest of the West. Frederick Jackson Turner is talking more about a bucolic settling of the West, and yet both of them would agree that by 1893 the so-called frontier of America was closed. Well, that might work for some, but in so doing, you know, they didn't take into account that that very year in September you're going to have the land rush down in Oklahoma, And it didn't take into account places like the Uinta frontier, where we are going to have settlement take place in 1905 and 6. Even before the Uinta Basin was open for settlement, already the Mormon pioneers had been in Utah for over 60 years. Utah itself had somewhere almost 300,000 acres under irrigation and about 200,000 people doing the work. And so they were being very progressive. And the Mormons were noted for flood irrigation, and they taught other peoples in the West how to do that and to be able to have a crop. Teddy Roosevelt in 1902 signed sweeping legislation in the form of the Newlands Reclamation Act, excuse me, in which certain amounts of federal lands in the West would be sold off, and then the money that came from that would be used to develop irrigation projects. The very first such project in Utah was none other than the Strawberry Reservoir, and even as it was being built, people are beginning to make plans of settling in the Uinta Basin. So not only was this water earmarked to go out into central Utah, but some of it was going to be coming down the Strawberry River to help feed the canals and so forth that would be needed in all of this settlement that was being planned. There were other things that were going on where agriculture was concerned. The federal government back in 1862 had passed the Morrill Land Grant. Again, it was a situation where each state receives 30,000 acres of land for each of their representatives. Then they can sell that land and they use it to build colleges. And so Utah State University is what we call a land grant college. And part of their mission was to help in agriculture and in the settlement of the land. And so that has been ongoing. In 1887, that was extended so that there were agricultural experiment stations put into the land grant colleges throughout the country. And Utah State University has been giving that outreach ever since. I can remember not too many years ago, just over here in Ballard, there was a big sign there where there was a agricultural test farm. There was another one up in Altamont, and this was the stuff that was going on through the Hatch Act and trying to help with agriculture. Homesteading, ladies and gentlemen, is a lonely business. You go out somewhere into the boondocks generally, and you might be miles away from anyone. There is an old saying that you cannot touch without being touched. And so what were some of the ways that these people stuck out in the hills could have that would help them to be, to keep in touch and to keep from literally, in some cases, going insane? One of them, believe it or not, was mail order catalogs, and the other one was rural free delivery. That was back in the days when people actually sat down and wrote letters, right, and stuck a stamp on it. But notice Montgomery Ward, Sears, Roebuck and Company had these big, thick catalogs, and they would send them out to people all over the country. And so in your little cabin on your homestead, you could be looking at the things that were available. And as electricity and other things became available to you in your home, then you could partake of some of these. I think it's interesting that you could actually buy a wagon. That's equivalent to us buying a car today. Stoves, have these dainty women's underwear. That's in case it gets cold and you live in the Uinta Basin maybe. And look at this, beards and so forth, but whatever it takes to make one happy. Rural free delivery started in 1896. So before the reservation ever was settled, 10 years already, there had been this mail being delivered out to people in the countryside. And of course, you have that old motto, neither rain nor sleet or whatever is going to stop the mailman from his appointed rounds. And I see that every time Gib Hollinger pulls in my yard in the wintertime. There had been developed through the industrial age in America a lot of wonderful equipment. I mean, to us, we look at them and think, oh, well, we see those things sitting around rusting in people's yards, farmyards. And but in their day, these things were absolutely marvelous pieces of equipment. Planters and hay mowers, We look here at this binder reaper. It used to be that if you cut your grain, it cut it down, but you know, and they actually had an invention where it would push this off into kind of piles, but now this actually binds it up so that you can pick those up with a pitchfork. Then you would have to take them into a thrashing machine in a central point. This thing didn't go up and down through your fields, but all of these things were a great benefit to early farmers in Utah, and anybody who was looking to come out and settle in the Uinta Basin was thinking about all of this kind of equipment that they would have. One of the pieces or instruments that was widely known in the Uinta Basin was the milk separator. When they came, some went into dairying and they had more milk than they could drink. And what they would do is use the milk separator to take the cream off. There were any number of creameries around the basin, and mostly in the early days that went over to Vernal. People had been there since 1876, and they had some creamers, and they could make cheese and so forth. In time, all of that will be on this side of the Uinta Basin as well as settlement takes place, but the cream separators. So there was just a lot of things that were in place to help people who were thinking about coming out into the basin to settle. But there was another side to it all. When we take a look at this area of northeastern Utah, this little red line that you see shows the boundaries of the original Ute Indian Reservation. It took in the whole valley of the Uinta, as it was called, and so any waters that flowed down and into the Duchesne were draining the valley of the Uinta. And so if it went into the Duchesne River before it dumped into the Green, it was on reservation lands. So it went clear to the tops of the Uintas, out into the Strawberry River Valley and so forth. But with the opening of the reservation, then these dark red areas that you see are the lands that the Utes were invited to select first. Once they had selected lands, then the rest of the lands, all of that area in yellow, is left open to white settlement. The areas up along the outer edges, Teddy Roosevelt took care of that by creating some national forests and things which we still enjoy to this day. But down in the valleys, all of this was available for settlement. But when you take a look at it, over here we have Heber, down along this area Price. Vernal was over here, always off the reservation. The Uinta Railway had come up from Mac, Colorado into this area of eastern Utah, but still very, very remote. Other than that, we have the Indian Agency within the reservation, and then over in what is today Gusher, they were mining some gilsonite there. And other than that, this place was pretty much isolated. You had to travel miles just to get into here over some pretty rough terrain. So people were looking at a costly trip just to get into the basin, first of all, to settle. And then when they got here to the Uinta frontier, they were going to experience some of the roughest terrain that one could experience. And it was so devoid of beauty that it actually swallowed up the hearts of some individuals. For example, in 1861, Brigham Young had sent people out here to look at the basin to think about settling it. And when they came back, they said that it was one vast continuity of waste and measurably valueless except for nomadic purposes, hunting and gathering by Indians, and otherwise just to hold the world together. That was their view of the Uinta Basin. Consequently, nobody came out in 1861 to settle. President Abraham Lincoln made it a reservation, and that was that. Matt Warner, famous bandit turned lawman who lived over in Price, when he was a young man, hired on as a wrangler on a cattle drive, coming up out of central Utah, going over to Wyoming. He got as far as, he said, where Roosevelt is today, and he had a girl back home, and so he gave it up and went back. But, you know, there was nothing here, just the rocks, the dirt, some sagebrush, no trees. Benjamin O. Davis Sr., a young black man who came out to serve at Fort Duchesne, recorded that when he came into the country, he came from Price on the train, then he had to come on the stagecoach, and as he got out at the top of Gate Canyon out south here in the Badlands, he looked off in this country, this vast emptiness, and he asked the stage driver, "Where is it that I'm going out here?" And he said, "Well, can you see that little tiny patch of green over there? That's Fort Duchesne." And Benjamin O. Davis Sr. recognized then what he was up against. When they wanted to open up the St. Louis mine, they had to get the Utes together, and Chipeta was still alive, and they were asking her, "What do you think? Should we be able to have this little wedge of land out of here to mine this gilsonite?" And she looked at it and says, This is nothing. You can have it." So even Native American views of some of the terrain was not all that good. One visitor from back east who came and was meeting with some of the early Duchesne County commissioners, as they traveled along, he said to them that it looked rather like a boil on the buttocks of the world. A terrible, yeah, a pretty apt description. So students, pardon me, my other life. So ladies and gentlemen, when you stop and think about it, there was a lot left, to desire here in this rough old land. And interestingly, when Roosevelt was founded and this place was laid out, right here on this bench was one of the most unlikely places to try and build a city in all of the Uinta Basin that was being open to settlement. But as it turns out, all things have been for the good. Ed F. Harmston and his wife Mary had lived over in the Vernal Ashley Valley area, and so he was familiar with this country. And probably when he looked at this bench and saw, well, it's kind of up here and there's no water. I mean, hey, look at it. You've got the flat area here, and on one side was a dry gulch, and on the other side was a dry gulch. Where was the water? Well, he was the one who was going to survey a lot of the land. He helped to organize dry gulch irrigation. He had it in his mind, there is a way we can get water down here. And besides, a city is going to make its way by having people living all around. It's all of those people who come into town and do their shopping and things that help to keep the city alive. And so he knew what he was doing. He made one big mistake, though, according to legend. He thought that he would name this place Dry Gulch City because that's just how it was. But his wife said, "You got to be kidding me. We're not going to name it Dry Gulch City." And out of love and some contacts she'd had with Theodore Roosevelt, it was decided that they would call it Roosevelt. And so that has stuck. One thing I appreciate about Ed F. Harmston, right out here in front of the college is Lagoon Street. And I've had people, when I tell them back east, I'm ordering a book or something, Lagoon Street. "Oh, do you have a lagoon on that street?" And no, but we were planning one once. Ed thought that it would be nice, just over the hill, down into Mud Flat or whatever you want to call it, down in the Narrows, down by where the junior high school is today, build a dam there and then flood that, and it would make this beautiful lagoon. How would that be today? You could go out and canoe and trees all around and have a picnic, and it would have been a wonderful, great park. But I tried to go over there in the snow, and I couldn't really see much. But it was my understanding that they actually did try to build a dam there once, and it washed out. It's that sandy soil, no bottom, and it was gone. And then somebody woke up and said, "Well, listen, we've had to put our water supply up on that hill over by where Constitution Park is now. And so how are we going to get water lines and things through a pond, a lake, all the time? We'd have to go way out around. It'd be very expensive." And so all of it together, they give up the idea of the lagoon, but by then the name was already on the plats, and so that stayed. What were the views of the opening? George Stewart quoted one old Ute who remains unnamed, that when the Americats came, they came in the many-manys. They came like black ants, head to tail, going across the country. And I think that's a pretty apt description. about 15,000 people came in to settle in the Uinta Basin during the opening. And it was said that you could be at the head of Gate Canyon and trace the Immigrant Road all the way to Ashley Valley. They had to go over there to, that was where the land office was. But you could trace it all the way to Vernal by the trails of dust streaming skyward, just one wagon after another. And it would remain busy for many years. Interestingly, some of those people who came here found it a little bit different. My grandfather used to always say, yeah, we came and we took a look around. If we'd had the money to leave, we would have, but we didn't, so we stayed. And a lot of people in my folklore classes from the basin have some kind of, a familiar statement in their families. Amanda Felter said that we were too hungry to stay and too broke to go. A little bit the same thing, but she says she always loved her husband and knew him to be a hard worker, but she never loved him or appreciated him more than after they'd moved here to the basin, and she really saw the timber that was in that man as he worked to make a living here in this land. It's kind of interesting, though, I think, because when the homesteaders came, guess what? About the first thing that most of them did was they built a 2-story house. They would take their wagon that you see like this, drive out to wherever their homestead was, whatever they had drawn out on, and then they would proceed to take the wagon box along with the covering off and set it, as it were, on sawhorses, leaving their wagon just a chassis like this. Then they could put in some staves, and they could use this to haul wood, lumber, and so forth, whatever they're going to need to build their homestead. In the meantime, usually the women are going to live upstairs in the house, and the men are going to sleep in the downstairs. But it was a beautiful 2-story arrangement. All too often, and the very first house or very first domicile in Roosevelt, believe it or not, was a tent. And many people lived in boarded up tents. They would basically build a box without a top and put the tent over the side of it and live on the inside. Some of these were very cute and quaint and commodious, and they would live in there and have a stove in the winter and get by. Believe it or not, Roosevelt's first hotel was a boarded up tent. And in time, they took mud and plastered the walls and did some things to it. But it was one big open room, had a big table there. People would come and dine at night and then throw out their bedrolls, basically, and sleep on the same floor that they had just eaten on a little while earlier. The first post office was a boarded up tent, and the first saloon. I knew there was a reason why our junior high school was the Rough Riders. It comes from this Rough Rider saloon, the very first one. Well, maybe not. Anyway, who knows what else found its way into a boarded up tent before it ever became a real true establishment. A lot of people, at least the homesteaders when they came, would go out into the countryside and they would build a dugout like we see here, dug into the hill or down into the ground. And there was a method in their madness. You know, in the summer they stayed cool. In the wintertime it was warm. And if they didn't have money and, didn't want to be in one of those boarded up tents, maybe fighting the cold in the winter and that kind of thing, they could be snug as a bug in a rug in one of these. But usually they're only going to be there no longer than they have to be, obviously. Then they're going to move out. But the ideal situation is that then these dugout homes would become their cellar so that they could put their carrots and other perishables in there and guard them against the cold. One of the more popular items in the Uinta Basin all around Roosevelt were these Homestead Shacks. And if you really look close when you're driving around the basin, you go around some of the old farms, you'll still see some of these buildings. You can't miss them. They're just a little square box, maybe 10 feet wide, 20 feet long, and they have this kind of rounded over roof like that. People still have them, using them for storage sheds, tack buildings, and things like that. This one is not from the basin, but this one is an actual Uinta Basin shed. And sometimes they built these on skids so that they could move them around. What you had to do when you homesteaded, you would get all the paperwork, and basically you'd pay $2.50 an acre, which was not very much even in the early 1900s. But then you had to prove up on the land. So you have to show that you're living on the land, that you have crops going and that kind of thing, and after like 5 years, then they sign off, and for the little bit of money that you paid, it's now yours. And so you had to have some kind of a domicile, and so they would build these buildings to show they had a house, and then hopefully later they could build a home. Most of Roosevelt was just a tent and shanty town made up of these very same kinds of elements. And then hopefully a modest home would follow, but of course we're going to think that that's going to come only in time. And that did take time for some people in the basin. Others came with enough money that they went about building homes, at least some boarded up configuration of a house that they later on could put some stucco over and gradually improve upon. There were sawmills already. The government, you have to realize that Fort Duchesne had been established in 1886. Though after the Spanish-American War, when the troops left here and went off to fight in that war, they didn't return. They had a contingency here. They had a little cemetery. They had to raise the flag and lower it every day and do some ceremonial things like that and kind of keep a presence. But in time, even that was dwindling away. But they'd always had sawmills in the Uintas, and so some had been operating. You could go to the government sawmills and buy lumber. But of course, there were other people out to make a buck, and they took their sawmills, such as they were, small little outfits, and went in there and started cutting timber. And so there was plenty of lumber around. If the price was right, you could get it and build yourself some kind of home. I remember talking to Lewis Hardinger. Some may have known him, others not, but his father had a sawmill up toward Heller Lake up in Dry Gulch country. And he talked about when his uncle died and how was he going to get up there? It was snowy in the winter, and his mother said, "You got to go get your father." And so he's just a teenager, and he left and he walked out across John Starr Flat and up through and into the mountains. He didn't quite make it to the sawmill, and so he had to dig into a snowbank and spend the night and then made it on up the next day. But that's the way it was in the basin. A lot of people simply didn't have the transportation or the right kind to get around, and so you would make do. But those sawmills were all over. People cutting a lot of lumber. One of the very first things that came about, interestingly, was brick. Swains from Vernal started making brick here in the Roosevelt area, and there were others also. The Mighton Free Press had a note saying that, can't remember the gentleman's name, was buying a brick machine that would turn out hopefully 10,000 bricks a day. And so they would bake them and have them ready, and so we have a lot of brick buildings around here in the Roosevelt area because of that. Well, if you could, you get out here and you build yourself a shack or dig a hole in the ground and you're going to live there, but even if you want to build a home, you might need some windows and doors. And so a lot of that kind of stuff still had to be freighted in. Des Pitt was one of the early freighters in the Uinta Basin, and things like windows and doors and all of the hardware, nails, cement, things like that, furniture. If you wanted a stove, you're going to have to ship it in if you didn't bring it with you. And it would take 3.5 days to go out through on the 9-mile road to Price, to the railhead, pick that stuff up, then 3.5 days back home, 7-day round trip. And so people learned that, there was no fast fix to things. Look ahead and be prepared. George Stewart always talked about some of the old timers who thought that there really should be somewhere in Roosevelt a monument to the cottontail rabbit. those who settled in and around Roosevelt in those early days, a lot of them were very poor, struggling. And so they learned to exploit their surroundings. For one thing, they had to haul their water in barrels generally, and if it was turbid and had sediment in it, they would take prickly pears and put in it, and it would settle that dirt out. Or cottonwood ash would do the same thing quite well. But my grandfather told me that because the cottontails were just thick, thousands upon thousands of them, they used to hunt them in the wintertime, and they would put them in a barrel, rabbit and salt, rabbit and salt, rabbit and salt. They would eat that in the summer, and while they were doing that, they would go up and catch fish. The rivers were in those days teeming with fish, and so they would salt layers of fish, put them in barrels, and have that to eat. And they did that a lot. Some said, it was cottontails and potatoes. That's what we lived on. Well, here we see a picture of Roosevelt in 1907. Wow, what a difference a couple of years can make. But you can see all of these buildings that were coming up and down along the street. Along in the 1880s, they had invented machines that could mass produce tin cans. They had tin cans before that time, like during the Civil War, but a lot of soldiers in the Civil War were sickened to death by food that was spoiled because they didn't have the process whereby they could get rid of the air, for one thing, in the top of the can. So there's always some bacteria in there, and they'd open it up, it'd be spoiled. And but by the 1880s, they had this process where they could make proper tin cans. And so all kinds of things like fancy meats and vegetables and so forth were going into tin cans, and stores in those days looked something like this, where you just had lots and lots of things coming out of cans. Here we see a picture from inside the old Roosevelt Mercantile, first grocery store in the area. There would be others that would follow. So old sheepmen, cattlemen, be out on the range and into their cup of coffee in the morning, or on their cereal, which might be Quaker's Oats. They would actually have this canned milk, something that I can remember one time my mother said that they were going to town, and there was a box in the middle of the road, and Aunt Tootie, my grandmother's sister, they called her Tootie, drove by this box. I said, "Go real close to it, Aunt Millie." And so when they went by, it didn't move. And they said, "Hey, there's something in the box." They went back, and it was a whole case of Wheaties. See, my mother born in 1925, so this is maybe, 1930 or something. And I said, "Mom, you mean they had, Wheaties back in those days?" And they never did find an owner, and so they ate those. Well, guess what? That dry cereal stuff goes back into the early 1890s. They came out as a health food, but there were the Post Toasties and Kellogg's Corn Flakes and others. And there were all kinds of other commodities like soaps and things that you could buy from these stores, and so people were going to frequent them for sure. In 1917, in some of the Roosevelt minutes, one of the things that came up was they discovered that everybody was dumping their tin cans and all those cereal boxes and stuff down on the south end of town. And so they had to take some motion to fix that. Well, when you build a city, usually you need water, sewer, electricity. I mean, we see all that today. I thought when I was working in California in construction that they had the final answer. If a contractor wanted to build there, you made your plat. If it was approved, the city came in, put in all the sidewalk, streets and everything, paved them, and then you wrote them out a check. But then if you broke up the sidewalks or the street or whatever, then you're going to pay big time for it. But all the water, sewer and everything was dubbed inside these property lines, and so it should have been quite simplistic. Well, most towns grow up totally backward to all of that, and Roosevelt for sure was one of them. There was no problem as far as a sewer system. It was as old as the ages, and throughout the city of Roosevelt, people had the old common outhouse. And this was good because they had a ready supply of toilet paper in those catalogs that were being sent out to them free. And so they could take that out there, look at all the fancy stuff they could buy if they had money, and then tear out a page for toilet paper. As the city was being built, and even before, it was incorporated, well, yeah, a long time before it was incorporated. Before it was laid out and people began to come here with the opening, already there had been some plans laid out for the Dry Gulch Irrigation Company. And it's interesting to me, all throughout Utah, we live in what we call a riverine environment. I always tell my students, think about it, when you go driving through Utah, a lot of people drive through, and I remember somebody, I was up in Wyoming, and a guy said, yeah, we have people come through here all the time. So, whoa, Wyoming is so beautiful, it's just green everywhere. And you think, where have you been? But what happens is because people go into the riverine valleys where you can get water and irrigate, then you just cut across into one, into the other, to the other. But Utah has just lots and lots of land that is just open, arid, and not farmed. And we see that with this satellite photo. And you can see the watershed from up around the Altamont area, and coming down from Neola, we have this area where the Dry Gulch water came down, collected, went out to different farms along the way, and gradually made its way down to Roosevelt. And that was really the first municipal water supply. People who came here, a lot of them were already used to that. You went out in the ditch in the backyard, dipped your water, used that for cooking, washing, drinking. And so it wasn't that big of a deal. Here we see an early Plat E from Roosevelt. Right along here is the Gulch. Car wash is right here on the corner. And I think some of us can remember this old canal that ran down through here. Notice there's a little narrow culvert looking thing they have drawn in there. There was another Dry Gulch ditch down below, down by McDonald's. A lot of these are still there. They're just in pipe and buried now so that we don't see them. But back in the day, they were there, and there were laterals that went off from these small canals out across through the city. So while some people were hauling water out of ditches or maybe a well that they had dug, though some people in Roosevelt dug wells, went down pretty deep and didn't find water, and so they would have to go to several springs that were just outside of town and haul water in barrels. But when the Dry Gulch finally got water down in these canals, hallelujah, it was wonderful. Notice we have here the old Shirtlift Hotel. That was the hotel that was once a boarded up tent, right, with mud walls. Later they got around to building an actual structure. But if you look carefully, you'll see running right along here is a ditch. And then a lateral breaks off, and right there is the front end of a culvert in Main Street. And then the water would run through the culvert, and here is the sidewalk. It's a bridge going across the ditch once again, and the water would go on down to people's gardens and whatever. And so if you needed water, there it was, go dip it out. George Stewart always told the story of when he was a boy and his mother took him into Salt Lake City. And they had water running down the gutters out there, and he was waiting, said, you can't wait in the car until we come back, and got hot. And so he went over and laid down on the sidewalk and bellied up to that water in the gutter and was having his fill when his mother came out, embarrassed at the whole thing. But she said, I couldn't bring myself to, harass him too much or to spank him or anything, because he was just doing what was natural. They'd run around as kids and play and drink out of those ditches. But as you go through those old city minutes, at least yearly, there is some kind of a comment about cleaning the ditches. One guy had come, in one entry, there was a dead horse in the ditch. They had to get it out. Evidently somebody went up, got the horse out, went over and buried it, and then he came to the city wanting to be paid for dragging this horse off, and there was no contract, so he got no money. But how many people were drinking out of the ditch down below, we don't know. Well, Roosevelt continued to grow. Here we see another picture from around 1910, and we can see that there were buildings coming up on both sides, still dirt roads. They'd built them very wide, thank goodness, so that we have a decent main street today. But by now, C.C. Larson had moved into the area, and he was quite the entrepreneur, had a number of businesses. One of the things that he put in was a roller mill. And this is very important because as people are raising their grains and so forth, they could come in and have them rolled for their animals and pressed into pellets for feeding and those kinds of things. And of course, the ever existing need for flour, for plain good flour. And so the mill would do that. By now, students, by 1910, there were lots of things leaving the Uinta Basin, going out to the rail yards in Price. One was wool. We had tens of thousands of sheep roaming the country here, and that wool went out every spring. And gilsonite in bags. And then also in time, as people began to grow alfalfa, honey went out in great barrels. And so always it seemed like there was some kind of a backload. Freighters would come out, unload everything they had, then they're looking around, what can I take back? And wool was a good one, and other products that were out there that were being developed here in the Uinta Basin. In time, the ditches weren't quite cutting it, and they weren't always necessarily dependable. And the city decided they needed to have some way of having a constant water supply. And so they went up on the bench west of town, and if you go straight up Lagoon Street, those little ball diamonds that are just right there at the base of the hill, that's where the ponds used to be. They had a couple of reservoirs in there, and so the water would flow down and into these reservoirs, but there was enough there that if something happened, you weren't getting water down the ditch, at least you had a while that you could drink out of the pond before it went dry. And but in time, that was hard to keep up with, and so they drilled a well next to the ponds to kind of augment, to make sure there was always water coming into them. After that, of course, they were looking for one water source and another. And to this day, Roosevelt is still looking for good sources of water because it's hard to come up with. Some of the early water lines that went in from the reservoir across what would have been the lagoon and over into the city were all made of wood. Seems kind of strange. You think, well, why would they do that with wood? But you know, they use wood pilings. You drive them into the ground. As long as they're not subject to oxygen and so forth, they'll last for hundreds of years. And so they thought, oh, these water pipes will last as well. And so the wires around them held them together tightly. Talking to Jay Mitchell, he said, yeah, I remember when I was a kid, they still had some of those old wooden water pipes in Roosevelt. And he said, I went with my dad. It must have been 1950 or something. But he said there was a leak. And he said when we dug down and found it, I watched in amazement. My dad went over, took a willow, kind of whittled it to a point, and broke it off, stuck it in there, and pounded it in with he put a little tar or something on it and drove it in with this goop on it, and the leak was fixed. And so away he went. And he was chiding that compared with nowadays where you have to take out a section, and it's quite a process. Turn the water off, you know, to half the neighborhood in order to make a repair. But so that's progress.
There's still some of that pipe being used in Roosevelt.
I think there is. Yeah. I saw one entry in the minutes where they must have put in, you know, it said that they had gone to Price. Evidently Price had some of this pipe left over and they could get it for the right price. And so when it first went in, it must have been smaller than what they would eventually need, because another entry sometime later was calling for larger pipe to come from the pond down into the city, and then they could have laterals off that would be smaller, taking them down the streets and that kind of thing. And but it wasn't until somewhere along in like 1917, you know, they started putting that water in before 1910. By 1914, they were looking at upgrading and doing whatever they could to make it better. And they thought, you know, we need to have a fire district to, in case somebody's house catches on fire. And so when they upgraded with their water mains and things, they put in early fire hydrants. And you can find entries where they were going to buy 250 feet of hose, and then somebody said, no, I think we need to raise that up to like 500 feet. Then somebody else bought another 250. So they had like 700 feet of hose so they could go off from one of these hydrants and cover this big area in town. And so with that, they could draw, you know, a line. So you are within the fire district. Outside, we don't promise anything. And so people wanted to be inside, of course. So they had a lot of this fire hose that they used. As far as the water is concerned, over the years they drilled a number of different wells and finally went up into Bennett and came down and over on the R Hill, built like a 500,000 gallon tank. Then that was changed out in the early 1960s for a full 1 million gallon tank, and they were getting water from Uriah Heaps. Some of you remember Ralph Shields, who taught at the old Roosevelt Junior High, and he was mayor of Roosevelt. I remember we were taking driver's ed, and every morning he'd pick us up over to the Pleasant Valley, and we'd come into town, and he'd go to the post office and do business, and then we were off to Uriah Heaps and all over the place, taking care of water business. But so we did our part in getting that in there. It still has not been enough. In the 1976, they were drilling wells out in Hancock Cove. Then about 10 years later, they were drilling wells up around Neola, trying to get more and more water in order to run the city. Somewhere around 5 to 6 million gallons a day in the summer. So the city has some great demands.
Was Uriah Heaps up by White Rocks?
It is, yeah.
Where the spring, where the water...
Right where those little cement, if you notice them, where that canal is up in Bennett, kind of.
Oh,
And then
northern Bennett.
it's like, as you're going north, they're on the west side, but kind of, there's some little square,
Yeah.
only about 3 feet above ground. And
Yeah.
Dad was on the city council then,
Was he?
and they're on tribal land, so they
Yes.
were dealing with the tribe on the water, and it just got more problems, and so they kept trying to find, but they didn't have other sources to go to. Right?
More independent, yeah. Well, we could probably have a whole quarter of education on water issues in the Uinta Basin, to say the least. One of the things that really surprised me, though, and you know, here again, when you think of the infrastructure that was available around the United States at the time that the basin was being settled, one of those things that they had was electricity. And by 1913-14, they were flipping on the lights over at Mighton and in Roosevelt. You can find in the minutes, you know, they were giving right-of-way so they could come and put in their power poles. And by 1920, they were building a new additional plant up here at Uinta Canyon. And so they had electricity. I can remember hearing old timers talk about, you know, early on going to school and having a kerosene lamp. And then one day they came home and there was just this wire hanging from the ceiling with a bulb on it. And it was like a miracle. Ching, turn that thing on and do your homework and eat. And it was wonderful. Maybe have 1 or 2 plugs in the whole house. But that was electrification in the beginning, and very much appreciated. Once again, we talked about that dairy industry in the basin as it grew, and within time, instead of sending the cream and everything over to Vernal to be made into cheese and other products, they were having the cheese factories here in Altona, Altamont, and elsewhere, and so it stayed home. There's an old saying that here in the basin, you know, when you really enjoy something, say, oh my heavens, that was more fun than cream day in Altona. You've heard that. And the reason is that people would have these milk cans, And usually there was a spring or some place that was really cool, and they'd keep that over the week. And then on Saturday, here they came into town, and they brought all of that stuff with them, and they did their trading. That's what my grandfather used to say, I've got to go to town and do some trading. A lot of it was barter in the early days, but basically they're going to sell their cream and everything and buy the stuff they need and go home. And so that's how it worked. The movies were alive and well. By 1913, Roosevelt already was showing movies. There was a business permit issued. So this guy worked a deal where he only paid $2 a night, just on the nights that he could actually get it together to show a movie, because it didn't always work for him. And so whenever he'd show a movie, $2, and that was his business license fee. And but in time, Roosevelt ended up with like 2 theaters and still has, the twin plus the other. And movies were big. By 1922, in the United States as a whole, there were 44 million people going to the movies every week. That's a lot of people back then. By 1929, it was 100 million. This is a population of the United States was 120 million, and 100 million of them are going to the movies once a week. So somebody wasn't getting there. Some were just going several times. And, the sad thing of it is church attendance in those days was about 60 million. About half of the population was making it to church, and so many more were making it to the movies. But the movies were an escape. I mean, get a load of this. Douglas Fairbanks, I remember when I was a kid, that thing came on television one time, and it was an old movie then, but how fun that was to watch the development of the airmail in the United States on film. And so this is not here in Roosevelt, this is somewhere else. I just borrowed that picture. Well, things were really growing in Roosevelt. By 1917, they'd actually come up with a telephone company. When the Army came in 1886, they had strung a telegraph line from Price all the way to Fort Duchesne. Then in the 1890s, people in Vernal thought, you know what, we need to put a line over and connect on. But what they did was they invested in some of these early old battery-driven telephones, so they could call over to the fort and leave a message and have it sent by telegraph. By 1905, when the Uinta Railway came in down to the Watson Mining District, 80 miles south of Vernal, then they strung a wire all the way into Vernal so that they had telephone. And they connected with the Indian agencies at Ouray and here at Fort Duchesne and up to White Rocks. Well, that was okay, but it didn't serve all of the basin. Back when that was done in 1905, who was over on this side of the basin, right? But by 1917, then it was necessary to do something with the telephone. First of all, they hooked onto the old telegraph line going through to Price, and they used that. And then eventually they took a line over through Wolf Creek Pass and into Salt Lake, and that served some of the more local city areas, and that line went straight through to Vernal. And so Neola and La Pointe, some of those upper towns were able to hook on. But other people in the basin were just left out in the cold. And so in time, the Uinta Basin Telephone Company was formed, and so we ended up with the telephone. But there are some really fun stories, and I think some of us in this room can remember the old telephone exchange system where you'd actually call up and say, could you give me 2419 or whatever. You gave them a number. And then, of course, the operator would actually have to pull these little thingies out and connect your call, A to B. And then it would ring, and somebody would pick it up on the other end. But they reported that at times people would call up and say, do you know where I've got this report to do, do you know where I could find something on so-and-so? I mean, it's like the operators were supposed to know everything. One story was that a lady called up and said, I'm going over to Mary's house, but my baby's asleep, so I'm going to leave the receiver open so that if you hear him crying, will you call me over at Mary's and let me know so I can go home? By 1917, they were starting to issue dog tags big time. It was interesting. There was an entry in the Roosevelt City minutes before that time, and this guy was getting paid for shooting dogs and burying them. So you didn't want to have your mutt come in from the farm into the city. You might come up missing. Well, now you're going to have a tag on them. In 1917, they were looking at paving all of the sidewalks. Concrete was more expensive. They didn't have ready mix and things in those days, but they could do pavement. And so they were looking at that, and before the ordinance could actually be brought to fruition and the sidewalks paved, in another meeting they said, wait. Downtown, that's different. On Main Street, we really ought to have concrete sidewalks down there. And I can remember in places in Roosevelt where they still had paved sidewalks over the years. Most of them are gone now, but downtown, they actually put in the concrete so that they would be better upgraded and look like an up-and-coming city. Well, 1917. I don't want to keep us here all night. Let me just read some of these. Dry Gulch Irrigation, Roosevelt Mercantile, Swain's Brickyards, Shirtlift Motel, C.C. Larson's Mill, General Merchandise, Hotel, and eventually Bottling Works. There was a Consolidated Wagon Company, the Harmston Realty, Rough Riders Saloon and Dance Hall, Sprouse Meat Market, West Side Restaurant, Pat Markey's Barbershop, and a Ladies' Beauty Salon. The new Utopia Movie Theater, Rich's Ice Cream Shop, several shoe repair shops, including the now famous Newton boots and so forth. They had the Campbell Dance Hall, which doubled as a roller skating rink when time were right, or they might show a movie in there once in a while to make a buck. Then there was a harness shop and a livery stable, and of course a blacksmith shop. Hat store and a 5 and 10 cent store. Heber Timothy had a kiln. He was digging up gypsum locally and making slack and so forth for plaster and things in homes. Harmston Drug Store, Burt's Furniture, Elroy Wilkins Grocery, Meat and Bakery, Frederickson's Garage. And then, because there were no trees when people arrived here, just outside of town, Dillman's had an arboretum where they were raising trees, seedlings and so forth, so that people could have some shade. And so that was 1917, and things were certainly moving on in Roosevelt. If you wanted it, students, you could get it, more or less. In the United States, reading and books were becoming very important. Between 1880 and 1917, the number of books in the United States that were published quadrupled, and along with it, literacy soared from just 80% in 1870 to 94% by 1920. And from its very beginnings, Roosevelt had a library. Somebody started to put it together, and eventually the city actually had a half mill. I mean, you look at the city minutes, and there were like 4 items on the roster, money to pay, daily expenses, money for this, money, and half mill for the library. So it was something that was important to them. I've tried to locate it exactly, and I think that it was in this little building in downtown Roosevelt. But the state of Utah began to look at libraries, and if you're going to have educated children, you need to get them into some books. And Mary Downey was called to be the state library director in 1904, and she tried everything she could to help local libraries. One of the things she did is she turned to the Chautauqua movement. The Chautauquas started along in the 1890s and back east in New York, and they were just a group that came together, and they would hold meetings and have instruction on cooking and the latest farm implements and so forth, do some singing, they'd have groups come with them. And people loved it so much that before long they were taking the Chautauquas on the road, and they traveled throughout the West and especially into communities that otherwise couldn't get those kinds of things. Mary Downey said, could you please come to these little communities and teach classes on library skills? And so they did, and it helped Utah a great deal. Well, Mary Downey suggested that Roosevelt try to prepare itself, because the great steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie, was giving away money. It was called the gospel of wealth as far as he was concerned. It's kind of like, well, those of us who have become filthy rich need to give something back to the community. And so he gave away like $100 million to finance libraries. Why? Well, when he was a kid and he came over from Scotland with his family, he worked in the factories back east, as a bobbin boy, and he spent lots of hours there trying to earn a little money to help take care of his parents and family. And but he loved America because on the way home he could stop by the library and check out books, and it didn't cost you anything. Over in Europe, in a lot of places, you had to pay. It was a subscription library. And so Andrew Carnegie became a self-educated man by visiting the library. And so he thought, I'm going to give that back. And what he did was he came up with what was known as the Carnegie formula. And he said, if you can, in your little community, show me that you have the money wherewithal to buy the books, pay a librarian, and keep the place up, keep the doors open, keep it warm, all the rest of it, I'll build the building for you. That was huge. And so, yeah, everybody's going to go out after that. And Roosevelt was trying. And in the minutes it said, let's raise our mill levy up to 0.75%. Tell Carnegie that that's what we're doing, and da-da-da-da-da. I think Carnegie wanted a little bit more than that. And what happened was you had to be able to show that whatever mill levy you were putting forward, you had to come up with at least $1,000 a year. That was just bare minimum that he would accept, because it'd take that much to keep the heat on and the lights going and the rest of it. Evidently, it didn't happen for Roosevelt. Ultimately, there were 23 libraries built up and down throughout the state of Utah through the Carnegie plan, but Roosevelt wasn't one of them. The library went on, however, people donating books, the city supporting it, though the mill levy went down to 0.5% or half a mill again. But eventually, in 1941, the new city building was built. And over here on this side was the old library. When I was a kid, I used to love to go in there and sniff around those books and find a good read. And so that has always been important. By 1919, there were about 3,500 libraries across the United States, and almost half of them had been built by Andrew Carnegie himself. Well, how do you get here from there? Try to cover this as quickly as I can. In the early days, the road coming to Fort Duchesne came in from Price along the 9-mile road and then into Mighton, and then across through Independence up to Fort Duchesne, thence northward to about where La Pointe is, and then into Ashley Valley. And the reason that the road came is because they had to cross the Duchesne River. You look at it now and it's a little piddly inflow of nothing. And I can remember as a kid, though, diving off that bridge there at Mighton into the water. It was deep enough you could swim, and we had a grand time. But it's all gone into lakes and things now, and irrigation ditches. And so what you see is inflow. Well, if you have 4,000 second feet running down there in the spring and 2,500 on an average over the year, that's a lot of water. Some of our larger canals here in the basin, the Uinta Basin Canal, is about 500 second feet. So that'd be like 4 of those canals running down. People used to catch, fly fish right through Mighton City. Well, in time, off from this old military road, and the military built this wooden bridge to cross the Duchesne River. Then another road was developed out of Mighton going west up through Arcadia, over Blue Bench, down into Utah, and up the Duchesne River to what they call the Golden Stairway, across to Fruitland, then through Strawberry and into Heber and Salt Lake. But that route was problematic because it was closed, usually from early in the fall to late in the spring, too much snow and wet and so forth. Then along comes Roosevelt. And Roosevelt had some competition, believe it or not. Cedarview and Ioka both were growing very quickly, as was Roosevelt, and who knew who would be the bigger city as time went on. The thing that really helped Roosevelt to come out of that was the fact that the government in 1913 decided to take the road up out of Mighton across the bench and then down what is called the Checkerboard Road. This is over on the North Mighton Bench over here, just out of town. And, that road goes like going on a checkerboard for sure. Then you would come into Roosevelt with the mail, and from there they would take out and go eastward and into Vernal. That's how the mail would go. That became the official route, and so that put Roosevelt really firmly on the map. And before long, everybody was coming that way. There were some other little changes. They one time went off the hill out to the Poline Road, straight down, and then into Roosevelt. And then finally, somebody said, why do we do that? Let's just go down this hill and head straight for town. And that's the way the road is today. But that didn't come along until in the late 20s for sure. And cars were becoming more and more popular. These guys are probably going 30, 40 miles an hour. That's why they're hanging on. But yeah, back east, everywhere, cars mixed with horse-drawn carriages. Well, it was the same thing here in Utah and especially in the Uinta Basin, but it brought about the advent of parking lots, for example. Where do you put the cars when you're at the ball game? It changed things for the West as well. It was really a dichotomy. You have the old cowboy types, but here's the guy driving the mail, and he's in an early automobile. And notice, I love this Wild West magazine cover. These guys are rustling cattle. And they've just loaded them in a truck and away they go. And so a whole different image of what was going on. There were only like 144 miles of paved road in the whole United States in 1904. And Henry Ford and others were cranking out cars like crazy. And so a lot of farmers in the basin made some good money over time, pulling cars out of every mud hole in another. This road might be all right when it's in the summer and dry, but the spring and other times, just simply a mud bog for sure. Well, travel in the Uinta Basin roads was tough enough even in good weather generally, but when it was bad weather, like these trucks trying to go over Indian Canyon in the wintertime, things were pretty ugly. Cars were tough though back then. I remember my great-grandfather, they said, went down Gate Canyon and a rain had come by and washed out a little bridge. And so he just putting along and he went off into the wash. And he just kind of backed his car around until he got it leveled out in the wash, drove down for a quarter or half a mile and up over the bank and through the sagebrush and back onto the road and continued on going. Nowadays we'd be calling for a wrecker, and that would be the end of that. There was something though about horses, and and in the basin they had lots of horses. My grandfather always said, "Oh son, you haven't lived unless you've worked with horses." He said, you take a truck or a tractor, and once you get that thing stuck and it's reached top end, that's it. There is no more. You can't get any more out of it. But he said a horse. He said a horse is like a human being. You can talk to a horse, and there's something way down deep inside that you can pull out of that animal. And he told me a story how the state road trucks came by one time and got stuck out in front of his yard. And that's how good the roads were, right? And it was stuck right up to the axles. He came home, he'd been plowing all day with his team of horses, and he passed those guys and he said, "You want me to pull you out?" And they laughed at him and said, "What, with those horses? You got to be kidding me. You can pull that truck out of there." And he said, "Well, I'll bet I can." And so he hooked his horses on, and they pulled and pulled, and they couldn't. And then these guys were laughing at him, and he said he took those horses by the ears and he pulled them down close. He said, "Come on, guys. They're laughing at us. We can't have them do this. We can do this. Come on, let's pull this." He said those horses just started to pull, and they leaned clear forward until their bellies just were down on that mud. Their legs sunk into it, and all of a sudden there was just a big sucking sound, and that truck came up out of the mud, and the guys were astounded. Well, lots of stories about horses, and man, and some of the marvels that were done. But I was curious in the minutes and different places where I would find passages. For example, people from Colorado were getting in contact with the Roosevelt City Council, wondering if they would write a letter in support of the Moffat Tunnel in Colorado. I mean, the road goes through, so why wouldn't you support it? And they said, "Yeah, let's write them a letter." And they did. And they were voting whether or not they should go over and help the people of Mighton, because the Duchesne River was about ready to take out the new steel bridge that had been built after the wooden one was washed away. And so they were always looking, at helping one another where roads were concerned. They had road improvement committees that they formed, and tried to mount some campaigns that would help to take care of that. Roosevelt City in 1917 voted to purchase a sprinkler rig, I guess to go on a truck, so they could have a tank and then this thing that would spray water out onto the road to keep the dust down. Still wasn't paved. And then about 1919, it was in the minutes that the state road had come to them saying, please, can we borrow your sprinkler? And I guess maybe they wanted to do some other towns or some extended area or something. And Roosevelt City was saying, yeah, we could do that. Well, more and more, the old cars came, and the horses went. If you didn't have a car, you could get on the bus, okay? And in about 10 hours' time, you could be into Heber. The United States started to put together a highway system, and by 1921, they came up with the Federal Highway Act, and basically what it did was the federal government gave money to the states, and then the states would use it to build their roads. And what they would have to do is the federal government would come up with half, the state would have to come up with a quarter, and the county up with a quarter. So you can imagine it didn't help a lot, right, in some rural areas if the county can't come up with the money and that kind of thing. But by 1923, then they called for a national highway system, and they developed what was known as the Lincoln Highway, today I-80 basically, and they came up with what they called the Victory Highway for victory in World War I, and it came across through Colorado and right through the Uinta Basin. And I just want to cover a couple of things here with regards to this, and then we'll cut it off. But
Our new water pipeline that's been referred to as the Highway 40 project
yes.
is being called now the Duchesne County Victory Pipeline.
Oh, is that right? Because of this, yeah.
Because it's following that line quite a bit from starvation.
Ever get it to fruition. Well, this helped. Here we see a picture on the top of Donner Pass. I wouldn't want to go over Donner Pass, just a dirt road up there. But by the 1920s, a lot of the Lincoln Highway was paved. Other places it was just good gravel, compacted and that kind of thing. But guardrails, we're starting to see a lot of changes where highways were concerned. But it wasn't like that everywhere. This is a letter that some people I met in California shared with me. They found this among his father's things when he died. And it's a letter from the National Automobile Club. So he'd written to the National Automobile Club saying, hey, I'm going to go up to Salt Lake, and from there I want to go over to Denver, and so which way do you recommend I go? And invariably, they recommended you go the Victory Highway. There's nothing up there on that Lincoln Highway. It's just flat and more flat, But if you go the Victory Highway, you've got mountains. It's beautiful. You can stop and fish and camp and see things, and it's just interesting. And so most people who were touring, for the sake of touring, this is the way they would come. But listen to this. This is 1926. Salt Lake City to Denver, 564 miles. Pavement is used via Temple, State, and 21st Street for 7.1 miles. Fence, fair to good gravel via Kimball's Junction to Park City. It is here necessary to use a good detour over county roads to Hailstone Junction, followed by gravel to Heber. Good dirt is then traversed to Fruitland with fair road, earth road to Duchesne, rough for the last 10 miles. And I suppose that as you come down out of the cedars, over those ledges and bouncing in your car, I talked to Bob Hewish, and he said that when he and his father came out in 1926 to look at the drugstore to see if they wanted to buy it, He said, I'll never forget coming down over those ledges and bumping around. And he said, it was like there were 2 car tracks going down through the trees. That was the road. And he said if somebody was coming up, of course, the courtesy is that the person going down pulls off. So he said you'd go bouncing out and drive around through the trees back onto those 2 wheel marks going down through the trees. So much for fancy national highways. It took a while to get to all of it, right, for improvement. They talk here about going after Duchesne, good gravel, next prevails to Mighton, then you go over to Roosevelt, dirt to Vernal, something about a detour there because of a bridge. But at any rate, and it's just like that all the way to Denver, dirt roads. And but people would come, and guess what? Because they were coming and wanting to enjoy themselves, that idea of car camping came about. These are some of the early camp outfits that people would have. They'd load everybody in, set up a tent. Hobbs and Goodyear put out actually a travel guide, and it talked about all the way from California to the East Coast. And they too said, take the Victory Highway. And then it was interesting, as you came down into Duchesne, there was a camp on the river. You could go down there and camp. And there was a hotel and a restaurant and so forth. Same thing in Mighton, same thing in Roosevelt. In some of the minutes talking about Roosevelt, as early as 1914, they were concerned because these people were coming and camping out somewhere near town and building these big bonfires and having a great time, bunch of city slickers probably. And people were worried. You know, they had that fire district, but it didn't mean they weren't going to burn the town down. And so they were worried about what are we going to do to control them? And in time, when Roosevelt, you know, they set aside property early when the city was laid out for parks. But the parks didn't come until later. But when they did, they actually had land set aside for where people could camp. And we're well past our time. We started late, but we've gone later. And so there were some other things we could talk about that would be fun, but we'd be here for another half an hour. So we'll hold up there, and some of it dealt with education. We'll turn that over to Mark Dennis. I think he's going to cover that in another meeting later on. So, well, all right. Thank you so much for your time. Hope it was enjoyable.
Uinta Basin special events coverage on VTV6 and Strata WebView is made possible by Century 21 Arca Real Estate Professionals, The Porch Southern Cuisine, Uinta Basin Healthcare, and Wind River Wireless.